Matters Committee. Today is Wednesday, January 25th. We have one briefing this morning, and it is by the Office of Commissioner of Financial Regulation. And I'd like to welcome the Commissioner and his team. And sir, the time is yours. Go ahead. Commissioner, 1 second. Just once the ring comes on, the red ring comes on solid, then you're good to go.
There we go. Thank you very much. Vice Chair Crosby, I appreciate it. Members of the committee, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to appear in front of you today to give you a little briefing on the Office of the Commissioner of Financial Regulation. We tend to refer to it as the Office, or OCFR for short, because the name is a little long, and probably hear more about that as the session goes on. With me today are some new members of our staff. So to my left, I have Ms. Sharifa Balogun, who is the new Assistant Commissioner for Non-Depository Supervision. I have Andrew Fulginiti, who is our Legislative and Policy Director and is also going to be taking over functions of the Maryland Student Loan Ombudsman. And then to my right, I have Amy Hennon, who is handling our state legislative work, as well as special projects that we have and working on some federal issues as well. So they're all new here today, so I will take the bulk of the presentation here because I don't want to put them on the spot for things that may have happened prior to their tenure here. But as I said, the purpose is to give you a briefing, an overview of our office. So our office is located in the Department of Labor. Our current budget is approximately $13 million. 98% of that money comes from special funds, which are paid into two special funds by industry members. We get a small slice for enforcement from the general funds. We also contribute money back to the general funds from our enforcement activities. So when people pay fines or they're assessed fines, those funds go back into the general fund. So our office is an administrative agency, as you know, but we're also here to help you and help your constituents to the extent you have questions or concerns or issues regarding financial service issues, or you want to achieve some legislative ends. Feel free to contact us. Members of my staff, we're always here. We're always open to working with you and doing what we can, both for you and for your constituents. So we could go to the next slide. So what is really financial regulation? We have at the top level, two parts of financial regulation. One of them is depository. So those represent our credit unions, our banks, and non-depository companies, let's say T. Rowe Price or Chevy Chase Trust, the large companies like that. And then we have what we call non-depository institutions, which are financial institutions that are under our area of supervision, and those are, the supervision is governed by Ms. Balogun here. So we also have in our area the new foreclosure registry system that provides us with significant data that we make available on our website and through the Maryland Open Data Portal. We also work with some jurisdictions to make sure that they have access to that data. Basically, our office, you'll see, covers almost every consumer in the state, one way or another, checking accounts, mortgages, money transmission, things like that. So we also have, in recent years, the Student Loan Ombudsman function, which Andrew will be taking over now, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We've been active and interconnected in that area. And I would recommend that if you have further questions beyond what we have here and you don't want to reach out to us, you or your staff can go online. We have all our annual reports on our office's website. We have the reports of the Student Loan Ombudsman, who's required to put one in every year. They're online as well. The General Assembly has asked us to provide some reports, and we've put those on the website as well. So if we go next slide. That's just for those of you who want to see, kind of a visual representation of our office. You can see the four areas that I mentioned. Deputy Commissioner Thorson handles the depository area. As I mentioned, Ms. Balogun handles the non-depository. We have Sean McAvoy, who handles our consumer services, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then Andrew and Amy handle our legislative and other special projects. If we go to the next one. So I think this is important for everyone to understand because we're really proud of it, and it drives what we do. We came up with this a couple of years ago. It was a reincarnation of our office's mission statement. So when somebody asks you, what does your Office of Commissioner of Financial Regulation do? You can tell them that our mission is to protect Marylanders through the operation of a modern financial regulatory system. And I would say that, you can tell folks our mission is to protect Maryland consumers. You can put a period right there. That is our primary responsibility. As I mentioned, we touch consumers' financial life throughout the state, and we regulate and have jurisdiction over all financial service providers in the state, with the exception of insurance companies or securities, who of course are handled and regulated by the Attorney General's Office of Securities. So the second key concept in that mission statement is the operation of a modern financial regulatory system, right? That means that we put those words in intentionally. That means that we're always trying to look forward. We're trying to do, state of the art, stay with the trends, not look back, not get stuck in the past. So those are two of the important concepts out of there. And then, of course, consumer protection, sure, we want to promote respect for consumers, safety and compliance, fair competition. But really, those are the two primary concepts. And in terms of the modern financial, think about that as internally, how we handle ourselves. I'll talk a little bit about that, as well as our external operations. We go to the next slide. Okay, so how do we accomplish that mission? Well, I guess I'd call OCFR small but mighty. We have a staff of approximately 90 individuals. They're all highly dedicated, mission-driven, and most of the staff is professionals. We're comprised of bank examiners, mortgage examiners, fraud examiners, money transmitter examiners. We have some attorneys that aren't acting as attorneys, but they work that way on staff. We have 2 AGs that support us on the advice side, and then we have 1 full-time litigation counsel. And we coordinate in some cases and then have overlapping jurisdiction in other cases with the Maryland Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. So we do our job, as I mentioned in here, through 2 ways. One is through direct action. The other is through what I would say is indirect action. So we cooperate and coordinate with other sister states and with the federal agencies that are responsible for these areas, such as the OCC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and I'll try not to use jargon, but OCC is the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and they regulate nationally chartered institutions. So one of the things I want to point out is that you'll hear us use, like I mentioned, some acronyms, and I think a couple of important ones, and one of them that I'll start out with is CSBS. That's the Conference of State Bank Supervisors. So the Conference of State Bank Supervisors is a 120-year-old organization that's dedicated to maintaining the dual banking system and the dual financial regulatory system. That's how our office works with the other state financial services regulators in the country to kind of supercharge our powers, right? So we work with them to investigate, to supervise large multi-state national institutions. So in that organization, I'm currently treasurer of that, and others in our office have other positions of leadership, not only in the CSBS, but in some of the other related multi-state regulatory organizations, and you'll hear why that's important as I go through. And secondly, I want to make sure everybody's familiar with the NMLS, which is the Nationwide Multi-State Licensing System. That's operated by a subsidiary of the CSBS, and that's the licensing system that Maryland and the vast majority of other states use to license financial service companies, such as mortgage brokers, mortgage lenders, money transmitters, debt collectors, check cashers. That's part of how we retain a modern regulatory system is we use the electronic tools, and that is a very important tool, and that is on the multi-state basis. So as I mentioned, I would guess we're one of the more plugged in and engaged agencies at the national level because of the way the financial services systems operate, right? It's really not limited to state borders, so there is a lot of interstate activity. And so in order to be effective, we have to work with our other state regulators. We have to coordinate with them. And as well, we are on a weekly basis in touch with either other state regulators or state or federal regulators. Again, the banking regulators, the Consumer Financial Protection Board, known as the CFPB, things like that. We're constantly speaking with them. So let me just tell you one example of how this works for the citizens of Maryland, how it works for us. So a couple of years ago in the CSBS, I was the chair of the District 1 Committee, which is the New England states down to our office. And you know, the climate change issue was just starting to get into the financial services realm, and we're fortunate that we have New York as part of the New England area, the New England district. So we were able to put together a committee with New York as part of that was going to work and is continuing to work to put together information for state regulators to educate state regulators on the issues of climate change risk in the financial services area, and B, put together tools that other state regulators in the District 1, and then now it's moved out to the other states, can also use as we work on that important area. And you know, we have some small states up here that don't all have the resources. New York DFS has 50 people that are assigned to this climate change issue. So we're able to really, you know, benefit from this exchange on a state basis. So that's why I call it a force multiplier for our office and for other states as well. Okay, so how do we operate the modern state regulatory agency? Well, as I mentioned, all our staff are fully capable of remote operations. That came about as a result of the pandemic. I mentioned this, and you may say, well, why are you saying we have high-speed audio-visual, you know, equipment in your office? Well, that's important because we are able to now, you know, produce and present some pretty quality internet video presentations so that people don't necessarily have to come to our office. You know, we're able to do that, and I think that's important for us to be able to interact in the best way possible with the citizens of Maryland and with others. We have on there, we've hired specialized IT examiners. We've hired a data analysis person on our staff. So I think, you know, that's the wave of the future. We are in the process right now of implementing a state-of-the-art cybersecurity industry monitoring tool that we'll be rolling out over the course of this year. We are focused on risk-based examinations and use of resources because, again, there's 90 of us, so we have to make the best use. We have to look for the people and institutions that pose the biggest risk and make sure we deal with that. And so, as I mentioned, we use the electronic licensing, and then we fully coordinate with all the federal agencies. I'll talk to you a little bit about the state examination system, which we call SES, which is another multi-state tool that's used to examine our industries. Okay, slide. Thank you. So let me just give you a couple of real high-level highlights for 2022. Number one, we received, each state regulator has accreditation from the CSBS and other national organizations, and we have been accredited for mortgage regulation and bank supervision for a number of years. We received reaccreditation in those two areas, but we also became the 7th regulator in the country to receive accreditation for our money transmission business. So we were very proud of that. We received accolades for our consumer education and outreach, and also for our use of multi-state examination and coordination, as well as the enforcement actions that we took in the past. So in our industry regulation piece, what we did was we issued mortgage regulations that have come out, and we have some other regulations that are coming out this Friday, as a matter of fact, that we worked on. We did a lot of outreach activity as things came out of the pandemic, so we were very happy with that. That's a very important area for us. And then, as I mentioned, myself and others in our office have moved up. I'm treasurer. Cliff Charland in our office is actually the president of the Association of Mortgage Regulators. So Maryland has the ability not only to get information from other states, best practices, and knowledge of what's happening, but we can also push issues that affect Marylanders up to the national level to make sure they get addressed. Okay. So what's our depository institutions? As I mentioned there, we regulate state chartered institutions. So as you can see from the slide, that means we directly are responsible for 21 banks, 7 credit unions. I'll go through the trust companies, but those are different animals, and there's just 4 of those, so that's not a big deal. With respect to Maryland's banks and credit unions, they're growing. They're positioned to support Maryland's economy. Again, probably same as us, small but mighty. Right now, they're in good shape to weather the economic conditions that we see going forward. Since the pandemic, the banks and credit unions, during and after, they're very supportive of their local communities, so we're pleased to see that. And then last but not least, as you can imagine, consolidation, you've probably read and heard in some of your districts is happening, and that is a trend that is likely to continue. Okay, so some of the hot topics that we see, I guess what I would say is if you had a conversation with one of the local bankers, you wanted to generate some discussion, what would you talk about? Cybersecurity, top of mind, right? That's top of mind for us, top of mind for them. It's not only, bad actors in the United States, it's foreign state entities, it's foreign individuals, it's foreign gangs that are preying not only on institutions, but they're preying on individuals. So, that is top of mind. I mentioned we have an IT examiner on our staff. CSB has provided a year and a half ago comprehensive training to all the states so that they could, IT training, so that their examiners could benefit from that. We have had a couple of instances of, some cyber breaches here in the state, and they've happened elsewhere. But the good news is that the institutions are all working hard to remain protected, to protect, their consumers. So we're happy about that. But we constantly tell them, you got to be proactive, you got to be planning, you got to make sure your systems are, up to date with patches and things like that. But that would be a number one discussion you have with them. Number 2, the uncertain economic outlook. I think, that's an issue because of liquidity risks, credit risks, and, the consolidation that we face. So in terms of liquidity risks, when the federal programs came out as a result of the pandemic, they, pumped a lot of money into the economy. Depository institutions were the beneficiary of that. People were putting money in the banks, and so their deposit levels grew. They used that money then to make loans, but they still had a lot of that there. That's all coming down, and we want to make sure banks manage that and they have processes for dealing with that going forward. Should I think it's unlikely, but should the economy really face the stress that they're prepared for that. On the credit risk front, the banks are all, to our examinations, reporting good quality credit right now, and we don't see deteriorations. But, happy to talk with them. They do have a negative outlook going forward. So the Conference of State Bank Supervisors regularly has a survey of state bank presidents and personnel, and that's on the negative side right now. So that perspective is, not encouraging. Again, what's another important thing to talk about is the ESG. That's environmental, social, and governance concerns, and that's an issue that, as I mentioned, is something that's important to all of us, and we recognize that. Maryland has one bank that's already pivoted towards a purpose-driven ESG approach, so it's something that, is coming up. Our office is going to be working with institutions on some of these issues so that they understand them and they're prepared for the future. Cannabis is not on the list, but I know you all will be working closely and, heavily on that this year. There is, just don't forget that there is a need to make sure that the banking piece fits in with whatever legislation you do to ensure that our state chartered institutions can participate in that business and bank them, right? Because it's still illegal at the federal level, and we want to make sure that we can put in whatever language can be put into Maryland law to make sure that it helps out with that. Last but not least, FinTech I mentioned in there, which are financial technology companies, and you've probably heard a lot of talk about that. Banks have always dealt with fintechs, financial technology companies. That is really nothing new. What is new is the scale of that. So, banks have a symbiotic relationship right now with what you could also call them as service providers. They're technology providers to banks because banks, particularly small institutions, don't have the wherewithal to provide all the back office support, the internet, things like that. They hire companies to do that. And our goal is to ensure that consumers and depository institutions are protected from these financial technology companies, that there's a level playing field, and that Maryland laws are followed. Okay. So licensing and supervision. This is now the other, I'd like to say half only because it's, depository and non-depository, but really, as you can see, with 21 banks, that's not the bulk of our work. The bulk of our work is in the licensing and supervision area of the other financial service providers, and that was 24,000 businesses and individuals. They held over 8,000 licenses last year. That is, the breadth of our office, as I mentioned: mortgages, money transmission, check cashers, debt collectors, student loan collectors. It's huge breadth. So that really, takes up a lot of our office's business. I appreciate the General Assembly passed a bill to eliminate paper licenses. Again, looking forward, trying to be forward-looking and modern, so that was really appreciated. That helps us leverage the NMLS to the greatest extent possible, and it provides a lot of transparency on people's licensure status, whether or not they have complaints against them, where they're located. It's really a wonderful tool to have. So that's an example of us using technology and partnership to do that. Not only that, but in that bill, it changed the reporting on some of the entities as well, the mortgage companies and things like that. So now we get electronic reports. We're not required to get their paper reports, have our staff translate that to electronics. So that's really great. In that licensing and supervision area, if any of your consumers, and we get them, but if any of your constituents, have issues with a licensee or a provider, please contact our office. I'll tell you a little bit more about our consumer services unit, which is dedicated to providing services directly to constituents, or if you all have questions about companies, please let us know and we can help you with that. As I mentioned, you'll see on the slide, last year, as part of the licensing process, $107,000 went back into the general fund from companies that were engaged in unlicensed business. Okay, so money transmission. Money transmission is very important these days. Everybody probably hears about it, participates in it, and that is a multi-state, multinational business. That is, again, another important reason as to why we work so closely with our federal counterparts and with our other state agencies, because just the reach is really important. So how do we do that? We work on multi-state examinations. So instead of 50 states going in and looking at each company, we put teams of states together. They go in and look at each entity that's subject to examination. And now, there's like a common core area of these examinations. And then, for example, to the extent Maryland has particular money transmission requirements, we push those up to the examining team. We have one of our examiners works with them to get questions for our particular regulations. So that's what we do. We have some changes in the money transmission regulation that are coming down. Last year, the legislature changed the money transmission law, and again, that was really appreciated. That helped get us closer to the national standards that are in effect in other states. It changed definitions. We did some exemptions from licensing, and we put in some safety and soundness requirements. Those are all part of what's known as the Model Currency Act. And so we're looking to this year issue, as I mentioned, some regulations. They'll come out on Friday to further get Maryland online with the adoption of the Model Money Transmission Act, which has been adopted by a number of states and is currently up for adoption, I believe, between 15 and 20 states this year. So hopefully at the end of the year, the majority of states will be either have passed or en route to pass that Model Money Transmission Act, which will really make a big difference. I mentioned at the bottom there virtual currencies. So virtual currencies are governed by our Model Money Transmission Act, or our Maryland's Money Transmission Act, to the extent they fall under the money transmission area. Okay. All right, consumer protection. This is kind of on the ending side of the presentation, but it's where we began, right? We have a consumer services unit, as I mentioned, that has dedicated fraud examiners in there. So when a consumer calls and complains about an institution, it goes to one of our examiners. They have a goal of resolving that complaint, but you know, since they're trained and they have specialty in this area, they can look at the complaint and do a couple of things. One, work on that specific issue. But number two, if there's a systemic issue, you know, they have the experience to elevate that issue. And they can elevate that to our enforcement unit, which I'll talk about in a minute, to go forward if there are any issues. And a real quick example of how this works in real life is one consumer called. She had an issue with being assessed late charges on her auto loan. So our staff reviewed that complaint, and after, you know, asking some questions about what happened, they asked for the loan documents. And when they got the loan documents, they were able to look at the loan documents and read what the late charge was supposed to be, and then look at what was actually charged to the consumer, and they determined that there was a difference. So when we went back to the lender and pointed that out, the lender, it was very quick because they realized what had happened. They had undergone a system change earlier in the year, and when they set up the new system that they were using to process their loans, they hadn't ticked the box for this particular type of loan to assess the late fee in this particular manner. So through that, we were able to get restitution for that consumer on her complaint, but the examiner also was able to now escalate that to our supervisory unit. So our supervisory unit then contacted that institution, and they were already aware of it, of their need to go back and fix everybody's account for these things. So that was step one. And then step two, that was then put into our system. So when we went back to do an examination, we were able to confirm that those things had happened. So that's kind of the integrated way that we deal with consumer complaints and how, you know, it really benefits your constituents. We have an enforcement unit that reports up to Ms. Balogun here, and they are responsible for investigating fraud-related issues, conducting specialized investigations of both licensed and unlicensed businesses. Right now, we're pursuing several, you know, important cases against out-of-state lenders that want to come into the state and try to do business without being licensed. So that's an important area. They work closely with local law enforcement. In case you think that, you know, this is just financial crimes or whatever, you know, in the last couple of years, folks have actually gone to jail for violating financial laws, and we had a hand in that, working with them and with the Consumer Protection Division. So as I mentioned at the end, we obtained recoveries for consumers. That was over $1.5 million this past year, and we handed out, and I think you'll have probably electronically, or maybe we'll hand out, a highlight sheet, and that has, you know, more specific details on what our office has done. So we can go on. Just if you have a question about, you know, consumer complaints, you can get this information from our annual report. I thought I'd throw that up there to give you a little bit of context. You know, the mortgage complaints, the consumer loan complaints are up at the top, collection agencies. Let me just tell you a little bit about the last one there, because I think that's an important one, and it also evidences our consumer focus here. That's non-jurisdictional complaints. So those are complaints against national banks, federal thrifts, other federal agencies, and out-of-state institutions that we don't ordinarily regulate. So if a consumer calls and says, hey, I have a complaint against National Bank X, instead of just saying, well, you should go to the comptroller of the currency, that's the regulator, what we've done is we've put together a listing of what we call escalation contacts at all these non-regulated entities, so that when consumers call our office, we escalate that complaint to that institution and tell their folks, you have a complaint coming in against you at a high, you know, at a good level. And then we do forward it on to the regulator so that the appropriate regulator knows about it. But this way, we give consumers an opportunity to get their complaint heard at a high level. And we just don't don't brush them off. That's what you get through the state of Maryland. Okay. I mentioned on the consumer protection, that's the same as before. I'll touch briefly at the end here with our student loan ombudsman. That was created a number of years ago. We have upgraded. We have a curriculum online for folks who want to learn about student lending and student loans. We have educational videos. We have modules available on our website. That's where part of our updated IT and presentation material comes in. And so, we're waiting to find out at the federal level what's going to happen. We were prepared to put out information through the state alumni associations, the college alumni associations. Sean McAvoy was the prior ombudsman, and he was very plugged in with those groups. And he was also plugged in with the state coalition of other ombuds people and the Department of Education. And once we, get more direction on what's going to happen on that front, we'll be pushing out information there. And last but not least, the outreach activity, right? So we have continued, despite the pandemic, to have our quarterly meetings with advocates and other stakeholders in our office, and I think that's real important. They get a chance to, directly speak together with myself, with the rest of the staff. And we had been, prior to the pandemic, going out to the different counties. We intend to, gin that up again. So we've done that. We've mailed over 49,000 packets to homeowners that are at risk of foreclosure. And so we're very proud of that, and the accreditation team recognized it. So that's where I will end that and open it up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Delegate Adams?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to you. The three questions, and I think they'll all be brief. The first one relates to the news fairly recently about a U.S. digital currency, a CBDC, or a central bank digital currency. Is your office participating with federal partners? And I would just be curious if there's any overlook and or thoughts on what that is and how that might impact Maryland. So your thanks.
Right. Unknown on that front, right? That's a Federal Reserve activity. So the federal agencies have not included us in that discussion, to my knowledge. If they have, Maryland is not part of that. To a certain extent, that wouldn't be surprising, right? We're not a large state with money transmission crypto companies. Those are in other states. So we're not there. I'm not certain how that would affect our local institutions. That's still up for study, right? Because that would involve where you put reserves and how money flows. I think that's a way off, though.
Yeah. I think at the end of our 4-year term, we probably are going to hear more about that because that just seems like the trend. The second question I have is cryptocurrency. Do you get complaints from Maryland constituents on cryptocurrency? That's national news as well. And if so, how do you deal with that?
Well, to the extent we do, we would handle them through our consumer services unit. So I don't think that the crypto space has generated a lot of complaints through our office right now. I don't have a specific number on that. We'd have to look at what it would be under money transmission. So as I mentioned, cryptocurrencies by themselves are not regulated by us really, or anybody, frankly, because if you're just using it for yourself or whatever, that's not an issue. It falls under state regulation, not only in our state, but throughout the United States, when you transmit that on behalf of other people, right? So that's then, you're required to have a money transmitter license in Maryland. And we do have some entities that engage in money transmission, and if they do crypto, they're required to be licensed by our office. So what's happened on the larger stage is those have been crypto exchanges. Those aren't licensed in Maryland. We had a bill in 2 years in a row, but that wasn't adopted to license those. Right. But they are licensed in other states. And so what we're doing right now is we're working through a coalition of other state regulators to identify what we need to do in these various bankruptcies of the companies that have gone under, because right now it seems like it was a combination of mismanagement, fraud, and frankly, poor business practices. So, but again, that's the exchange part of it, not the money transmission part, right? So nobody's saying, you weren't giving my cryptocurrency out properly. So that's where we would be involved if there's a complaint on that front.
Thank you for that. Last question, if that's all right with you. With marijuana and cannabis, I mean, there still are federal laws on kingpin and racketeering as it relates to, the cash business that exists within that industry, we'll call it, the one that we're creating. Two questions. One, those laws still exist, right? And then two, how would Maryland hold banks harmless if they're being told by the state that you have to do business with these new cannabis companies?
So yes, to your first question.
Sure.
The laws still exist. I think the concern is, and this happens in other states as well, and in Maryland, right? You identified it as being potentially a cash business. There are a couple of institutions in the state of Maryland that undertake to bank cannabis businesses in the state, and in order to do so, you have to navigate a very tight window of federal banking regulations. So I'm not, I'm not a criminal lawyer, so I don't pretend to understand, that criminal piece. I do know, though, that if a business is legal, a financial institution should be able to bank it.
That's right.
And so if cannabis is legal in Maryland, we want to ensure that our local institutions can bank them. And one of the concerns is that we make sure that when federal law says local institutions can carry out the mandate of local law, it doesn't say something like unless otherwise prohibited or something like that. So my point is, let's just make sure we have something that says Maryland banks don't fall into that unless, there's a positive statement that says you can do that business. That's kind of the language that I was thinking of.
Delegate Howard.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Commissioner. Just very quickly, walk me through, you were talking about the patching. And who do you regulate as far as the patching? Is this all state agencies, or you were talking about computer patching, you have an IT department?
Right. So we regulate the institution.
What?
Banks, credit unions, mortgage companies, all those financial institutions.
Okay.
So when we go in, not only ourselves, but the federal regulators have an examination program to identify their cyber and IT preparedness. So for example, we would look at their computer processes and say, have you, these are known vulnerabilities.
Right.
Have you applied whatever, just to throw out a company, it's ubiquitous on Microsoft Patch, right? You see that. Have those all been applied to make sure those vulnerabilities are taken care of? So we don't regulate the service provider that does that.
Right.
We regulate the institution to make sure that they have policies and procedures that require that to be done, and then that they actually do it.
Okay. What kind of teeth do you have to go after them when they don't?
The institution itself, we have pretty good teeth. We can go after them for monetary penalties. We can go after them for cease and desist. We have a range, a memorandum of understanding, a cease and desist order, monetary penalties, and we can go after individuals if we feel there is, specific intent not to comply with the law or to violate the law. We can ban them from the industry.
So there's certain, like in the government, they call it an N status, right? So it's a N-1. You have what's called bleeding edge, and then you have patch +2. Is there, I don't want to get too much in the weeds,
Sure.
and I'll make sure I call you, but I tell you what, we'll talk offline. I'm interested to see, how big is your IT department? I mean, is solutions architecture, who's in there?
We have we rely on Do It for our IT. So there's our own internal, right, state office IT that we rely on Do It. Now, we did just last year participate in a tabletop exercise with the Treasury and other state and federal regulators. So we are conscious of that, but that's primarily a Do It responsibility.
Right.
We did that with their knowledge and assistance to make sure we were prepared, because when you're part of the financial regulatory system, you've got kind of responsibilities to others, that other states and other regulators.
Totally understandable, and
Right.
I'm not trying to, kind of squeeze you on the questioning.
Sure.
I'll definitely call you. It's just we've seen hospitals, and that's really where the money is medical records. And we've seen hospitals and other things be held hostage. So I'll definitely reach out to you. I just want to make sure you have all the resources available.
I appreciate
For
that.
emergency,
We do identify that, and we, like I said, we do have two examiners, one specially IT, another one with IT expertise.
Excellent.
But they go in and they run the process, right? The exam procedures to ask the questions along the way to make sure that. But, I mean, that's top of the mind.
And again, you know, a lot of this is hybrid, cloud-based, on-site, and when it comes to that type of cloud-based computing, the entity is responsible for the security. Cloud is responsible for the physical security. They're responsible for the security. Sometimes that's hard to keep up with and see.
Absolutely.
Essentially, and so I'll reach out to you, and I appreciate your.
Yep. One last point, don't forget though that our institutions are covered multi-layers, so every state chartered institution is also overseen by a federal regulator with more resources. So whether that be the FDIC or the Federal Reserve, they also provide their IT review, and they have a much larger set of staff.
Excellent, thank you. I'll be in touch.
Great,
Thank you.
appreciate that.
Delegate Harrison.
Just to follow up on Delegate Adams' question, when you were mentioning cannabis and you said, don't forget that we need to consider the banks. And my question is, have you offered a suggestion on how not to, or are you going to? So, because the regulations are being written now, and so your input certainly is needed.
Sure, I'd have to go. I think Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, I've reached out to committee staff and the leadership, and we're working on providing some suggestions.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you, Doug.
Delegate Chi.
You hear me? Okay. All right. Thank you for the presentation, and I'm very pleased to see Mr. Andrew Forgianiti here in his elevated role. Hopefully, going forward, our office has really enjoyed working with you. My question is related to predatory lending in the state of Maryland. I assume this is a concern, and I would love for you to give us an idea of to what extent you are cracking down on such practices. Especially, I'm interested in knowing if we have a cap on APR and how much that is for the non-banking institutions. Thank you.
So, yes, Maryland does have a lending cap, 36%. Our office is pursuing now, as I mentioned, a couple of cases. They're in the administrative process. So the way we operate is we issue a cease and desist order to entities or individuals to tell them to stop. If they contest, it goes to an administrative process. They then have the opportunity to go take that outside to go to court. In two of these cases, which involve tribal lenders from out of state that were charging excessive interest rates to Marylanders, they have decided to go outside the administrative process. So those were, made public to the extent they filed at federal court to try to change that. Both are now back in the administrative realm. So those are important cases because they're questions of, which law applies. Is it Maryland law or other laws? We believe that if you're making loans in Maryland, you're responsible for following Maryland's lending laws. So we take that very seriously. To the extent we see or hear of people that are engaged in predatory lending, we prioritize that. We take action. As I mentioned a couple of years ago, we were aware of what they call title loans out in Western Maryland. We pursued some actions out there. We actually got some jail sentences on people there. So we will take that action when we're aware of it. But we've got to get information there. And that's why we go out. We talk to the advocates. We talk to the consumer groups and different people statewide so we can try to understand what's happening in the marketplace.
I also want to echo thanks to Andrew for all your hard work. I know everybody in this room has dealt with you over the last 2 years. And you were really the single point for the UI claim, every UI claim for every citizen in the state. And you did amazing work. And you've come a longer way than that. You were once Delegate Fisher's staff, and we all apologize. So, last question for you, Commissioner. Yeah, I know. You should get a T-shirt. I survived Mark Fisher. But yeah. Last question for you, Commissioner. You said that there's 21 banks and 7 credit unions in the state, and all are doing well and thriving. And then you also made the comment that we're going to continue to see a trend of consolidation. And I'm just curious, what are some of the factors for the consolidation, even though these industries or banks are doing really well? How can we, better prepare ourselves to make sure that there's enough banks in the system and competition remains, across the industry, even though, they're all doing well? Like, how can we prep against that?
Well, that's a great question, because we want to make sure that we're able to ensure that there's, access at the very level, that it's equal and equitable, that funds are distributed and kept local. So that's a big concern. Some of the whys are, what you said, they're doing well. So if institutions are doing well, other larger institutions are going to want to do one of two things. They're going to want to either take out a competitor that's doing well, if they're already local and they want to expand, or they're going to want to come into our marketplace and they're going to want to do that. So that is, really two of the driving concerns. There are some others. For our institutions, the cost of compliance is really high. And sometimes that cost is not necessarily recognized. But I know, the issue of, like I mentioned, access to banking is a concern. And sometimes you're thinking about, we did a study, it's on our website, about the branch deserts, banking deserts in the state. But the maintenance of branches is a cost that, a lot of smaller institutions are finding hard to maintain, because on average, the branches that most banks have are older, right? So you then incur costs to update those and upgrade those to operate a modern system. So we took a few steps a couple of years ago, the legislature did, to change the laws on incorporating institutions in the state. So that's a good first step. There might be incentives to come into the state and establish that. One issue that, I see is at the federal level. So while we here in the Office of the Commissioner can charter a local institution, be that a state chartered bank or a credit union, they still need insurance from the FDIC or the National Credit Union Administration. And that's where it gets a little difficult, because, the federal depository institution agencies are concerned about risk to their funds. So we need to work with them, and that's something we try to constantly do to make sure that, they see the business case for Maryland institutions. But we're working on that. That's not a Maryland problem. It's a state problem throughout.
Well, thank you so much. And seeing no questions, that concludes the hearing. Thank you all, and I'll see you again at 1:30.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
Hi, Steve. How you doing?
I know, with all the recognition.
Well, thank you. Give me 1 second. Did you all receive?
Mr. N.
Let me
How are you?
Please, my law clerk, Commissioner Salazar.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. I just don't want to rely on federal partners. I do it all the time.